Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'll start the proceedings. Hello to the PSA members, families, and friends. My name is Michael Griffiths, and I am honoured to be the President of the Public Service Association of South Australia. I also recognise we have Lindsay Oxford with us, our former President. just for them who've forgotten who he is. I'm a long-term PSA member and also a correction officer for 30 years, and I'm certainly especially proud to be a member of this great family of public sector workers. Now, before we begin the forum, I'll just run through a little bit of housekeeping. Toilets are behind by the lifts for you there. In the event of an emergency, an alarm will sound. Please don't use the lifts. Make your way to the emergency stairs, which are also behind the stage by the lifts. And the evacuation point is out the southwest corner of Hindmarsh Square, which is obviously behind myself. Now, if you have mobile phones, which I'm sure the majority of people will have, please can you ensure they are either switched off or to silent. There will be penalties for those that have one go off. I've got one. I'd also like to remind you this is a non-smoking building, as all places should be. And the prisons are getting there soon too. If you require any assistance, please ask the wonderful PSA staff who you see scattered around the area wearing our beautiful PSA logos. Now, I'd like to obviously start with an acknowledgement in relation to a statement of acknowledgement. And I would like to acknowledge that the land we meet on today is the traditional lands for the Kaurna people, and that we respect their spiritual relationships with their country. I also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the traditional custodians of the Adelaide region, and that their culture and heritage beliefs are still as important as the living Kaurna people today. Thank you. So on behalf of myself, the PSA General Secretary, Nev Kitchen, the Assistant General Secretary, Natasha Brown, welcome you all to this fantastic event. And I don't know that I can recall the PSA putting on an event like this, but this is going to be special. I extend a special welcome to our guests, the Premier Jay Weatherill from the Labor Party, Leader of the Opposition Stephen Marshall, and from the Liberal Party, Tammy Franks from the Green, and Nick Xenophon from SA Best. I will now pass on to the PSA Assistant General Secretary, Natasha Brown, to open the forum. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. It's great to be here this evening with so many fellow PSA members and South Australians who are passionate and proud about our public sector, and for us to be able to share the evening with the political leaders in this state who can do so much to influence the status and role of the public sector in South Australia. The PSA is the principal public sector union in South Australia. We are a union of South Australians who have chosen to dedicate our working lives to serving the community. Our union has been involved in actively supporting, promoting, and protecting the public sector in South Australia for 133 years. We believe the most fundamental role of a government is to ensure its citizens have equitable access to the public goods and services they need to thrive. A well-resourced public sector is the foundation of a fair society and a strong economy. This should be any government's highest priority. South Australia's public assets and services belong to our entire community. They are not the sole property of the government of the day. They should not be sold or privatized as a way to make budget savings or short-term cash injections by lowering the quality of public services provided to the community or by reducing the wages and employment conditions of workers. The PSA believes that our democracy requires transparency, openness, participation, and accountability between our government and our community members. We, as the community, must be able to hold our government to account for the provision of quality government-funded services. We look forward to this historic forum It's timely, and we know that it will cover members our issues are deeply passionate about. Now, please join me in welcoming our forum facilitator this evening, Victoria Perman.
Good evening, everyone. My job as facilitator is to keep our participants to time, and we have Beck on timekeeping. Ring the bell, Beck. Okay. That doesn't mean your coffee's ready, it means your time's up. And so I'll be keeping everyone to time and to ensure that everyone has an equal time to respond. Each of our participants will have an initial 3 minutes to outline their party's position on privatisation. I'll stand taller, I think. And their views on the role of the public sector in South Australia. The PSA wrote to each of the parties they represent in December last year, asking for responses to 7 specific questions about issues of concern to members. The Premier, the Shadow Treasurer on behalf of the Opposition Leader, and the Honourable Tammy Franks on behalf of Greens Leader Mark Parnell all responded. To date, there hasn't been a written response from SA Best. Those responses which have been received will all be published in the next PSA Review magazine, unedited. You can read all the answers in their entirety, and which is being printed as we speak, so that will be available to members very shortly. In anticipation of tonight's forum, the PSA also emailed members asking them to send in questions for those who couldn't be here, especially rural and regional members. And I'll be presenting those questions directly from the mouths of members, if you like. And after that, we'll open up the floor to questions, and I'm sure there'll be lots from this incredible crowd. So we'll wrap up about 7:30. Time for you all to head home and prepare for another hard day at the coalface, which we all appreciate very much. Firstly, we'll hear from our speakers. We've elected to follow the order of precedence. I'm sure you all know what that is, being in the public sector. So first, the Premier, then the Opposition Leader, then the Honourable Tammy Franks MLC, who is the Greens spokesperson for the public sector and industrial relations, and then the Leader of the SA Best Party and candidate for the seat of Hartley, Nick Xenophon. Welcome to you all. Round of applause, I think, for everyone. Thank you. So I'd like to welcome the Premier to the microphone.
Well, thank you, Victoria, President, Vice President, Assistant Secretary, members of the PSA, ladies and gentlemen, and of course my esteemed colleagues. Stop laughing, Oxlade. Can I begin by saying my earliest memories were of my father, who was a union organiser with the Australian Government Workers Association, as it then was, now the United Voice. Travelling around with him during my school holidays as he would visit country regions, talking to workers that he was representing in the public sector. And I watched him and I was proud of him, and I wanted to do exactly the same thing with my life, and that's exactly what I've done. Every single day of my working life, I've been representing workers. First, I started at the Australian Workers Union, then I went to a law firm, and then I set up my own law firm in 1995 before coming into Parliament. And for me, I regard my role in Parliament as just an extension of what I've always done. Stood up for working people, advocated for them strongly. The things that motivate me are a sense of justice. I hate injustice, just as my father did, and my mother instilled in me a strong sense of social justice, wanting to stand up and fight for working people. That extends to my ambitions about the role of government. The role of government for me is to actually take steps to reform the systems of government to make South Australia a better place. And I believe there is a role for government in doing that. And I think the mood of the age now is that we need government more than ever. We've been through a period of neoliberalism where the role of government has been rolled back. We've had all the privatisations, the catastrophic privatisations of ETSA. We've seen all of the damage that's caused when we don't have the community taking control of its affairs, but rather we seek to abdicate that responsibility to the private sector. And sure, you can regulate it, But the truth is, it's much stronger if you can control it yourself. That's one of the reasons why I believe in a strong role for government. What does that mean, though, for the public service? Well, the role of government taking action is through you, through public servants. That's how we do things. That's how we change things. That's how we make the world a better place. Some of the great public policy projects of this nation and of this state have been through the public sector. The great public education project, the great public hospitals project, all of the major changes that have made this a fairer and better place to live have been because we've made investments in the public sector. Everything that we've done and created together in this state has been led by a strong government working with a strong business community, backed up by a strong community. That's my commitment to you, to continue to reinforce the role of the public sector as a leader in this state. I believe this is not a burden to be minimised, but an asset that we should realise the value of. Thank you.
Thank you, Premier. Opposition Leader Stephen Marshall.
Thanks very much, Victoria. To my parliamentary colleagues, to Michael Griffiths, the President, to Lindsay Oxlade, sitting behind him, looking over his shoulder, making sure he's still doing a good job, the former President, and also, of course, to Nev Kitching, the General Secretary, and Natasha Brown, the Assistant General Secretary, but most importantly to all of you who have come out to listen to 4 politicians. Well, I suppose you've got a real interest in hearing what we've got to say, because we have an election on March 17, and it's a very important election for the future of our state and, of course, for the future of the public service here in South Australia. Now, Jay told you about his earliest memories and his father, and I'm going to now maybe do the same with my earliest memories and my father. We came from a business background. I've only been in politics for 7 years, unlike Mr. Xenophon, who I think been in politics for my entire adult life. I've only been in politics for 7 years, and before that, can I just say that I was in the private sector, and we had a family business. I had 200 employees in that business, and my father always taught me that the biggest asset in our company were the people that work for us. So I think this is really a truism of most people in the private sector, not all, but most people in the private sector learnt this 4 or 5 decades ago, that the biggest asset in the organisation are the people. The government in South Australia does not recognise this. They're stuck in some 1950s, 1960s methodology, which is all about promoting their mates, spoils for themselves, protecting their positions, and quite frankly, not enabling their employees to help us as a state achieve our full potential. That is going to be a major difference if the Liberal Party forms government after the March 17 election. Let me tell you just very briefly what we will do. Number one minister, one chief executive, one department, because we believe that there needs to be much greater accountability and responsibility put into the system, clear lines of reporting, and no shunting of responsibility when ministers don't perform to blame it on public servants. Secondly, a far more rigorous cabinet process with a strengthened role for the Cabinet Office. No more just running things in for the Cabinet to sign off without the public service and the departments actually understanding what the implications for their departments are going to be for government decisions which are being made. Thirdly, very importantly, restoring the merit principle for a professional and impartial public service in South Australia. Can I tell you, in the last financial year, there was 192 separate exemptions for the merit-based selection process for public service appointments. It's doubled in the last 2 years. We've got to get back to a merit-based appointment. No more jobs for the boys here in South Australia. And finally, one of the critical things that we will implement is a smaller ministerial office. When I'm speaking to senior public servants, they're sick to death of being bossed around by media graduates from McGill. The reality is we've got very serious, capable people in our public service, and they need to be respected and listened to. Thank you very much. I don't want to take...
Hang on a minute, I'm a media graduate from McGill.
And a very good one. Stop bossing people around.
Thank you, Stephen. Tammy Franks from the Greens.
Thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge the PSA and acknowledge that I'm here on Kaurna land and pay my respects to the elders past and present. I also want to acknowledge the power of a union, the power of movements. I am previously a member of the CPSU many, many years ago, and currently a member of the ASU. I've come from the community sector, and I've worked in areas of social justice, human rights, and mental health and advocacy for decades. I'm very comfortable standing here as a Green because the Greens believe that essential services belong in public hands. They can be provided for the good of all of South Australia, and that is the way that they should be viewed. The privatisation of the power network took SA down the wrong path, pushing the cost of electricity through the roof. And if history has shown us one thing, if it's not nailed down, the old parties will sell it off. But the Greens believe that public ownership of public infrastructure and services is fundamental to a fair and prosperous society, a good society where a fair go is had by all. Whether it's transport, education, electricity, water or health, public ownership means that we can prioritise the collective need and ensure justice, equity and the environment needs are met. Investing in public services doesn't just keep our society democratic and accountable, it gives us the means to look after those most vulnerable people in our society. We believe that quality education and healthcare are fundamental human rights, and the UN agrees with us. Regardless of how much you earn or where you live, you should have access to good, essential public services. Our kids should go to quality public schools, and we should have public servants, not private corporations, delivering government services, and our infrastructure should be built with public money on the public accounts. The Greens have long stood against a tax on essential services. We stood against the corporatisation of TAFE. We stood when the Rand-Foley government, during the budget lock-up, looked to take away your entitlements and slash public sector workers back in 2010. Indeed, I remember standing on the steps of Parliament House with you back then as Kevin Foley, the then Treasurer, had dubbed you all dinosaurs. The Greens also won't buy into beating public servants up for not being at the coalface. When people extol the virtues of our nurses and doctors in the public health system, those nurses and doctors need orderlies and administrators. We get it. We get that it's not a divide and conquer mentality and that the public service needs to be strong across the board. Otherwise, you're all overloaded and you can't deliver the very public services you're there to deliver. We know that transforming health has been a minefield. We look forward to reconsidering some of those decisions and ensuring that people are given a voice in decisions. One of the pillars that we believe in is grassroots democracy. That is the people who are most affected by decisions being part of making those decisions. And you as part of the movement, the union movement, and you as public sector workers need to be part of those conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy Franks from the Greens. And last but not least, Nick Xenophon from SA Best.
Thanks very much. Firstly, and I'll race through this in 3 minutes. Firstly, an apology for that survey not being completed. It's been completed. It's unacceptable, but you should have it on your website very soon. It's been sent to you. And Stephen, I didn't realise you reached adulthood at 30. You were a late bloomer, weren't you? This is a very timely opportunity to set out SA Best policies, priorities, if we're successful in holding the balance of power after the March 17 election. At the outset, I want to make the point that public administration, the business of government and the delivery of services to the public is likely to be conducted in a future political environment quite different from that accepted in the past 100 years because the two-party system is eroding. And if we are in the balance of power situation, we want there to be greater transparency, greater accountability and an environment where no one political party can simply have its own way, that there must be negotiation, there must be some compromise and consensus and consultation, and that ought to be the new political norm. That may make the major parties uncomfortable. It may mean that the current political order, those holding ministerial and parliamentary seats in their party machines may find this prospect unpalatable, but I actually think it'll be good for the state. Power sharing and negotiation may well afford new opportunities for parliamentary reform, and efforts to enhance the accountability of executive government and transparency in decision making. We need to have a stronger role for the Auditor General, stronger FOI laws, and importantly, strong and effective whistleblower protection law, so that if a public servant believes that something is not right in a department, they should be able to speak out without fear of their careers being ruined. And that is going to be a key policy for SA Best. We've had a politicised public sector, which I think is bad for the grassroots, the rank and file, those overwhelming number of public servants that want to do the right thing for the people of South Australia. We want to see an independent, professional and independent public sector that isn't shy of telling the government of the day about the potential risks and consequences of policy choices, a public sector that is frank and fearless to government and its most senior officers that are ultimately dependent on the favour and the whim of their political masters. We need to change that paradigm. Ongoing employment must be a primary form of employment across the public sector, and we need to see a marked reduction in insecure and contract employment. We want to see a public service that invests in the skills of permanent employees to deliver the very best and most cost-effective services for the public. I don't like what's been happening in Dipty, where you've hollowed out all that engineering expertise and instead you pay a fortune for consultants. Public sector recruitment and training is a critical component of efforts to build the skills of South Australia's workforce as a whole. We need to look closely at these areas of the public sector that are under the most stress in terms of resource and service demands, and at ways of allocating resources more objectively in a way that is fair, that deals with where the real demand is. Both Labor and the Liberals have privatised significant public assets and institutions, and under the Labor administration, selling off the LTO, the MAC, privatising those timber assets has been absolutely wrong. I hope that after March 17 there will be a new environment where the public sector service can be empowered to deliver the best outcomes for South Australians. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I'll now go to questions sent in by PSA members. They're not my words, they're their words. We'll try to fit in as many as we can, and then at 7 o'clock open up the floor to questions. So the first question, and I think in fairness we might start at this end of the panel and go that way, since we started the other way. So these are framed generally. Mr Xenophon, does your party have any plans to reduce the number of public servants, and if so, how? Everyone's mic, so they'll continue to see.
So the short answer is no. I know that under the Rand-Foley government there was some consideration of a slight reduction in the number of public sector a number of years ago. I think those plans are off the table. It's a question of driving a better delivery of services, and the short answer is no, and there ought not to be any further privatisations.
Tammy Frank, same question. Do you
No.
have any plans? Oh, well, I don't need to repeat the question then. Stephen Marshall.
I think you'll see a very different approach for the Liberal Party at this next election. At the last election, we were in dispute with the PSA on the issue of having a Commission of Audit. We won't be doing that. That's not a policy that we're taking to the next election. In fact, what you've seen for a long period of time now is the Liberal Party out arguing about the cutting of frontline services in particular in South Australia in the health sector. So we're not going to have a number that we put to this. We will, and I think we've been very careful to be very prudential with our commitments so far in this election. There will need to be some efficiencies. Tonight I've announced that we will reduce the size of the ministerial offices to save $20 million over the forward estimates, but the savings that we're looking for are modest and they are all very much achievable.
Are you putting a number on that?
No. No, we will be asking like the government did after their mid-year budget review, we'll be looking for an efficiency over the entire public service to be delivered commensurate with the commitments that we make. But as I said, we've been making very careful, prudential commitments so far over this election, and we'll continue to do that over the remaining 5 weeks. Moreover, I think the major difference between Labor and Liberal is that we genuinely believe that we've got a great capacity in South Australia to grow the size of the South Australian economy, and this will bring in a commensurate increase in state-based taxation revenue. If you need any proof of that, look at what happened in the 15-16 year. The actual growth for South Australia in the 15-16 year was 0.3%. That translated directly, when the mid-year budget review came out after that year, as a write-down of $380 million in state-based taxation revenue. Now, that $380 million could have been funding quality public services in South Australia. Instead, we didn't get that revenue because our economy didn't grow. We didn't have the right policy settings in place. So we are unapologetically for careful, considered, but deliberate growth of our economy, increasing the state-based taxation revenue so that we can provide, preserve and grow quality public services here in South Australia.
Premier?
I just don't believe a word of what I've just heard. And the reason is this. We've got Nick with his policy of an operational audit of the public service. We've got Stephen with his establish a South Australian Productivity Commission. And we've got promises from you already. You're going to need to save $360 million for your ESL promise, $156 million for your payroll tax promise, $100 million for your training promise. And that's before both of you, Nick and Stephen, start on land tax relief, which you've already given a commitment to. So you're going to have to find $616 million over the next 4 years. Are you seriously telling me that you're going to do that with just eliminating waste? The only place it's going to come from is from all of the people sitting here. That's where it's going to come from. 2/3 of all of the jobs in the public sector are frontline services or near frontline services. So what they'll do is they'll then say, we'll confine it to the so-called back office. How much left do you think of the back office will exist when you try and take $616 million over the next 4 years out of the public service? And that's before, we saw the front page of the paper today, that's before any potential GST reduction to South Australia. $557 million, which is at risk each year. And don't take my word for it, it's the federal Liberal backbench that are fearful of this report that's sitting on Scott Morrison's desk. It's been put off till after the election. So this is what's going to happen. We're going to be after the election, all of a sudden it'll be shock horror. Nick is going to match all of the tax cuts that has been thrown around by Stephen.
No, you can't say
Well, let's see. Let's just see then. And what will happen is that the operational audit, your words, is going to have a look at the public service, and all of a sudden you'll find that there's a need to cut waste. Your words, eliminate waste. Eliminate waste sends a shudder down the spines of public servants. They know what that means when it comes down to it. It means cutting jobs. And there's a reason why you've got that in your policy, Nick, because you've got 8 former Liberals in your team, and this idea that somehow there's this third way, there's not. There's just 2 Liberal parties sitting here doing the same thing they always do. That is basically cut taxes to the big end of town and make you all pay for it by cutting public services. So that's the equation at the next election. Labor standing up for public services and the 2 brands of Liberal Party cutting public services.
Would you like to respond, Stephen Marshall?
Well, look, it's just an embarrassing answer from the Premier. The amount of items that we've identified so far are actually smaller than the blowout on the new Royal Adelaide Hospital. I mean, the waste and mismanagement of this administration knows no bounds. We don't want that incredible waste. We're going to be listening to the public servants. We're going to be listening to the clinicians. If the government had been listening to public servants and the clinicians, we wouldn't have had the incredible blowout that we've had on the new Royal Adelaide Hospital. That's just one project. There are so many examples of where this government has blown its own budget time and time again. Now, the reality is the Premier hasn't addressed the biggest issue that we raised, and that is the issue of the underperformance of our state's economy, which is bringing in fewer and fewer dollars each year. I mean, the reality is we need to grow our economy to bring in state-based taxation revenue, and our economy is not growing under the policy settings that the Premier's put in place.
How can you say the economy is not growing?
0.3%.
It has the fastest. It has one of the fastest rates of growth we've seen in recent memory. You keep repeating this lie over and over again. We've created 20,000 jobs over the jobs that we've replaced. So every job that's been lost, replaced, 20,000 new jobs, 20,400 over the last 2 years, 70% of them full-time. This is a growing economy. This idea that mythically you're going to make up for all this revenue that you're going to cut through reducing taxes by having a growing economy, nobody's buying it. Everybody knows that the cut in revenue is going to have to be replaced. Unless you can either increase deficits, you won't do that, find another source of revenue, you won't do that. The cuts are going to come from public services. Everybody knows that's what you're going to do. We'll wake up one day at the other side of the election and all of a sudden the audit will say these are where the cuts have to be. Same old Liberal story.
I might come to Nick. Did you want to respond
Yeah,
to
just
anything
say that what I said is that if you actually have a position where if there are frontline services that need more support, if there are areas where you can reallocate services but still keeping the total number of public servants, I think that is quite different from what the Premier's characterised. I'm a bit confused. Labor says I'm in bed with the Liberals say I'm in bed with Labor. Corey Bernardi says I'm practically a Trotskyite from his speech in Parliament today, so it's all very conflicting. But I think the key issue is we should not be reducing the number of public servants. It's about empowering the public service to more effectively deliver services without any reduction in numbers.
We have heard the word efficiency. It does send shivers up the spine of everyone in the room, right? We've also heard eliminate waste. Can you tell me, all of you, if you look around the room, who here is wasteful? Who has a job here which is a waste or needs to be eliminated?
Victoria, the point that I'm making is that the states that are growing are the states that are increasing the size of their public service. In South Australia, despite the Premier's protestations, the reality is the last corrected year of gross state product figures that we've got nationally, not made up by the Liberal Party, the APS, shows 0.3%. The nation grew by 2.7%. We grew by 0.3%.
This is a fantasy.
Okay, I'm going to go to another question from a member emailed in. If the focus is on South Australia increasing jobs, why are cuts being made to the public sector? And I think that goes to that point about if we want our economy to grow, these are full-time jobs. Is there anyone here who will commit to increasing the size of the public sector?
Well, I think it goes without saying that the best chance of the public service getting larger is under the Liberal Party because we will... Well, no, I'm sorry, but we are unashamedly for growth of our economy. And as you grow your economy, you need to increase the size of your public service.
You did say efficiencies before, though, so is it growing or efficiency?
Well, there's plenty of waste and mismanagement in this government's administration. Just take, for example, their outrageous expenditure on spurious government advertising. I mean, that is an area which is very, very difficult for anybody to justify. I mean, when I open up the Sunday Mail, I really want to be informed about fact, not have more and more double-page ads from this government. Money which should have actually been spent on quality public services.
Can we get back to jobs? Any plans to increase the number of public servants as a way of investing in full-time jobs in the South Australian economy, Mr. Marshall?
I'm not quite sure of your question.
The question is, we've got to focus on increasing jobs in our local economy, in the South Australian economy.
Absolutely.
Will anyone here talk about growing the size of the public sector to create some of those full-time jobs?
Well, from my perspective, no, not in the short term. I make that, I'm being quite frank on this issue, but over the longer term, we do have an ambition to grow the size of the South Australian economy, and that will require a greater number of public servants in South Australia.
Tammy, you've been... I haven't gone to you, I'm
There's
sorry.
a couple of things I want to say. One, we would actually put public transport back in public hands in total. We would create jobs in that way. Now, they're not new jobs, and we will rail as we continue to do. We will ensure that people aren't put on ongoing contracts, part-time, over and over and again. Public sector jobs should actually be good jobs. I spoke to people from Pathology SA this morning, and I understand they're pretty under the pump, they're understaffed, and they're continually on casual contracts, which means people are leaving the state. Talented people who we should be keeping here, and also people are then waiting much longer for their health results, putting pressure on other parts of the public service, which is why we get to things like ensuring public transport and other public services are in public hands. That's actually how you have a cohesive and well-run system.
I think in the short term you ought to increase the graduate and training programs, which I think have have seen real cuts, and I keep going back to DIPT because of the people I've spoken who've been there and who've got out of DIPT. I think you can fund that by reducing the amount of money that's spent on consultants and outsourcing of advice that ought to be provided by the public sector in the first place.
Okay. I'm going to go to privatisation.
What's the Premier say?
Did you want to respond to that? I'm sorry, Premier.
Well, one of the commitments that we've made, it also goes to the question I anticipate you're going to give about privatisation, is that the first election commitment that we made was to re-establish an ENWS. This occasion, an Energy and Water Services Department. We believe that one of the catastrophic mistakes that was made was the privatisation of ETSA, and we've all seen what that's led to. We're going to rebuild the South Australian government control and influence over our electricity market. You've seen that with the investments in the state-owned power plant. That will be government run. That will be run by South Australian government employees. We will create a capacity within an agency to recreate the skills and capabilities necessary to administer an energy system. A much more complex energy system than existed in the past, but one that now needs high quality public policy, permanent public servants to give us that policy capability and that operational capacity. We're also going to decorporatise SA Water. We're going to take it back into a government agency so that, because it is absolutely cherry ripe for privatisation, that's exactly what it was being prepared for when the Liberals were last in government. We're going to make sure it's in government hands, and we're going to legislate to make sure it stays in government hands. We think those essential utilities of energy and water belong in government hands, and we'll also be making some other announcements during the campaign about rebuilding the capacity of government to create and deliver essential services so they remain in government hands. So in that way, we will be increasing the number of the size of the public service, and we're already having to recruit very substantially to meet our new responsibilities in relation to the energy market. The Minister's new powers of direction mean that they need a substantial set of advice. So we're having to rebuild a lot of capability that was lost with the privatisation of ETSA.
I'm sure you'll all get applause at one point in the evening. I won't rule that out of order. That goes to another question from a member. How, perhaps, Mr Marshall, are there any services or functions that have been privatised that you would consider bringing back into public ownership?
I can't think of something off the top of my head, but while we're on the issue of privatisation, you know, the Premier's sort of always making sort of this innuendo that the Liberal Party's about to flog off SA Water. I've ruled it out now for 5 years. And in fact, the only party that there's any evidence that there's secret dealings being done to flog off SA Water is with the Labor Party. I mean, we know for a fact that the Labor Party and Treasury commissioned KPMG and spent $100,000 to look at the privatisation options for SA Water. So in fact, whilst the Premier says that he's not going to privatise, he spent $100,000 of taxpayer money actually looking at precisely those options. We don't have a privatisation agenda. We rule out selling SA Water, and quite frankly, there's not much left to sell. This government has flogged off the forests, flogged off SA Lotteries, flogged off the Motor Accident Commission, outsourced the compulsory third-party protections, and of course, as we know, they're in the midst of selling off the LTO as we speak. So it's a bit rich for you to come here and say that you don't want any privatisation.
Chance for you to respond, Premier, and then we'll come to Nick, I think.
Well, pardon our scepticism, but we'll never ever sell ETSA.
We'll never ever close the repat. We'll never ever close the repat.
Yeah, and we will always invest to modernise our hospital system, and we're not going to allow our patients to be treated in rundown 1940 hospital facilities.
Do it up. You've had 16 years.
We'd still be rattling around in the Royal Adelaide Hospital and the Rabbit Warren down there if it wasn't for this government investing in upgrading every major hospital in this state. We make no apology for our investments in public hospital systems across the whole of this state.
Nick, on the privatisation question, you have told the PSA and...
Can I just add?
Sorry, I
will come to you.
You have told the PSA members that you would reverse the privatisation of the Lands Titles Office. Do you stand by that now, and where would you find the money?
Well, the whole issue of the LTO, that's a jewel in the crown. What we invented, this state was responsible for the Torrens title system for secure, fundamental in any society, to be able to have security of title over real estate. We need to use every measure possible to reverse that, because the fact is that the revenue from the privatisation, I think $1.5 billion, is going to be paid for by South Australian consumers. Make no mistake, the cost of conveyances, the cost of buying or selling land or real estate will simply go up in order to pay for that privatisation. So my view is that we need to do everything possible before it's too late to reverse that so it stays in public hands. How we do it is we need to do it. There are sovereign risk issues, there are a whole range of issues, but the LTO and the Torrens system is something that could be an export market for South Australia, not something that's flogged off to a private corporation.
The question was, where would you find the money, I think. Could you address that question? Where would you find the money to do that?
Well,
this is the question from a member.
Sure, and the issue is there are several things you can do. If you can't reverse it, then you need to have stronger regulatory controls so that consumers aren't gouged at a state level. I mean, the problem with privatisations is that the government gets to reduce its debt, but then you transfer that onto private households who end up paying more for services once they're privatised than they used to pay when they were in public hands. So that is the issue. I think when I made that statement, that was earlier on in the process, but I think what we need to do is to make sure that consumers, that South Australians are disadvantaged, and in terms of the whole issue of the LTO, to see the feasibility of what it can deliver in revenue to us as a state in terms of the export potential of the intellectual property of the Torrens system.
This is a complete fantasy. This is a complete fantasy. Nick is seriously suggesting that he might turn around a $1.6 billion contribution to state government revenue, of which about $700 million has been pumped into every public school in South Australia, in one of the largest investments in public education that we've seen in living memory. Is he seriously suggesting we're going to tear up a contract that delivered that? And in that same contract, every single service that's now provided by the LTO will be provided in the future for no greater than CPI increases. So every single service that's provided, all those registration services, what we're selling is the commercialisation of the data. LTO was always commercialising its data, just it wasn't getting a very good price for it. The public sector pays a massive amount of money to get access to this data, and that's what we got the value for. And it's sensible for the government as an aggregator of data to actually take that, cash it in, and then reinvest it in public services. And that's exactly what we did. This is classic Nick, misrepresenting the position, somehow frightening people that you're all going to pay more for your registrations. Your registration will be exactly the same as it was yesterday, as it was going to be tomorrow. It will only go up by CPI because that's built into the contract. It's got nothing to do with sacrificing the protections of indivisibility of title and everything that sit there. The Registrar General still supervises that in exactly the same way that they always did.
Mr Marshall, any comment on that?
Well, look, we didn't have, we're not party to the negotiation. It wasn't one that had to go through the Parliament. We are sceptical about the deals that don't go through the Parliament. The Motor Accident Commission was another such example where we said to the government we wouldn't be supporting the sale of the motor or the winding up of the Motor Accident Commission unless there was a full cost-benefit analysis done and independent inquiry. The government said, well, we won't even use the Parliament then. So I think that is a problem. I mean, the Premier talks about these protections. I'd like to know exactly and precisely what those protections are, because he promised exactly the same thing with compulsory third-party rates for insurers in South Australia, and that protection has already run out. So it was in place for a period of 2 years. So we need to know that there's not going to be some massive increase in costs when those protections are removed.
Do you agree with Nick that everything should be done to look at bringing it back into the public sector?
I think it's impossible to do that now. And look, I do accept, I do think that the figure that was negotiated was an incredibly much larger than the Treasurer originally envisaged, and we do support the fact that that money coming in was used to offset debt and improve services or the physical environment in our schools. So from that perspective, I think it is impossible, and we would be opening ourselves up to massive sovereign risk. I mean, who's going to enter into a contract with the South Australian government in the future if Nick Xenophon gets to control the parliament and then starts winding back deals such that every future person that enters into a deal with South Australia says, wait on, there's just too much risk in South Australia. It would be an absolute disaster.
Tammy, sorry.
There was just one other thing. I felt like I was a bit in a war zone, so I didn't say this bit before. The Greens have put on the agenda, both at a national level, to re-regulate our power system. And one thing we could be doing here in South Australia, other than the good start that's been made with concessions, is actually to have a state-owned energy retailer. That stops the retail rip-offs, and it's being put together by Solar Citizens and others, and the Greens will continue to advocate for it. We raised it with the government when we were talking about potentially having a banking tax, a tax on the banks here, but unfortunately that didn't come to fruition through the Parliament. But we do believe we actually have to look at ways to raise the revenue to ensure that we have that good society that we really want to see, and a public energy retailer so that the retail rip-off is stopped, particularly for the people on the lowest incomes, is something that we can do with that energy system pretty quickly.
Thank you. Question from a member: why doesn't the government come out and support the public service, not just nurses, police and firefighters, etc., and openly acknowledge and promote the majority of hard-working public servants?
Because when you do, it doesn't get reported. That's the first thing. Suddenly, everybody went to get a service today, and nothing went wrong. You know, it's not a great news story, and that's one of the great tragedies, is that when things work beautifully, as they do in our hospitals, our schools, in our public service, our public transport system, almost invariably, almost all of the time, very little is said about it. It's assumed, and so sadly that credit is not given. I can only tell you what I used to do as a minister, and many of you would know that I've been a minister for 16 years, so that's something that Stephen reminds people of. And in all of my responsibilities, I was always stood up for the workforce, especially when they came under the attack, and they've come under savage attacks at different times in difficult agencies like child protection or in the education system, where the last person that sought to help is the first person that gets blamed. And I've always stood up for workers in all of the portfolios that I've represented, because I strongly believe that in the quality public services that are delivered, it's very easy to just point the finger at public servants, and I've tried always to do that, and I've thanked public servants when they've come under attack. I've defended them in Parliament when they've come under the attack. When your shadow education spokesman, as he then was, David Pisoni, described the public education system as rotten to the core, I defended South Australian public teachers and public education, public servants against those attacks. Most of the attacks, shamefully, have come from our Liberal opponents, and I'll always stand up for the South Australian public service.
But surely the question was really talking about when will the government stop putting the blame for things going wrong onto the public service? I mean, the reality is, did anybody take ministerial responsibility for the rape of the child at the Western Suburbs School? No.
Absolutely.
Did anybody take...
Absolutely.
Who took...
Me.
Did you resign?
No, but neither did anybody that was in a position further up the food chain in the public service. I mean, the person that took responsibility is that bastard that's in jail, and that's exactly who should have been taking responsibility for it.
I'm sorry.
And I've got to say that the idea that you point the finger at public servants or even ministers who had no direct responsibility for the rape of that child is an absolute disgrace. And
what about the cover-up? What about the cover-up that went on for years and years?
What you're doing is what you did in the last election campaign, for which you had to apologise to me because you defamed me during the last election campaign.
That's not true.
Blaming people.
Please don't lie.
Please
don't lie.
You apologise.
Can we let the Premier finish, please, Mr. Marshall?
The idea of politicising child protection, the most difficult area of public service, where the last person that goes near a child is the first person that gets the blame, And to point the finger at anybody, including a minister, when something disgraceful like that happens, just demonstrates that the Liberal Party have always been about playing politics about these things, not about improving public services.
We want open and transparent government in
No,
South
what you wanna
Australia.
do is
We've got
play
nothing
politics.
like it. We've got nothing like it whatsoever. You've done everything you can to run a secret government where every single thing that's ever gone wrong is kept hidden from the people of this state. And not once have I seen one minister in the 16 years of this sorry government, and certainly in the last 6 years of your administration, ever take responsibility. Whether it was the DeBell inquiry, whether it was Oakden, whether it was the chemotherapy dosing bungle, not once have I seen a minister take responsibility. Now, there's a reason why ministers need to take responsibility in the Westminster system, because the buck has got to stop at the top. And not once have you or your government taken responsibility.
Mr Marshall, are you then going to say and commit to the people here tonight that if there are errors in government that your ministers will face the chop?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I made this point very clearly when we had this Oakden inquiry. The Independent Commissioner Against Corruption came to the Parliament and said he wants to have the powers to run an open ICAC inquiry. The Liberal Party drafted the legislation, put it into place. The Labor Party used their numbers in the lower house to block it. They will use any technique they possibly can to keep the truth hidden from the people of South Australia. And at the time I made the statement, and I stand by it, I told my people in my members of the Shadow Cabinet, if one of you had performed like the ministers responsible for this, I would, one, expect your resignation, and two, if it didn't come, you'd be out of the cabinet. And that's what people expect.
What about the public servants who are involved in those very difficult situations? What sort of are you talking about the same punishment for them?
I'm not talking about sticking public servants out to cover up for ministerial failures. When ministers have had reports sitting on their desks for months and months and months, they don't want to read it because they want to read it after they get back from the Easter holidays. I mean, give me a break. Ministers need to take responsibility. They haven't been under this administration. They will under a Liberal government.
I will come to you, Nick. Tammy, can you understand why public servants feel attacked when these debates happen?
Absolutely. I can also question why somebody like Peter Vaughan was made chair of the TAFE SA board when prior to being appointed to that position, and I would say that the Greens actually tried to amend that, we opposed that bill that corporatised TAFE. We tried to amend the membership of that board to ensure that whoever was the chair actually had an educational background. That was rejected in the Parliament. But this was a man who'd actually dubbed TAFE a sheltered workshop before he was then given the role as chair of the board. Now that's not respect for our public sector, but somebody like that, I'm glad in the end did get sacked, but he should never have been appointed in the first place, and it should never have been corporatised in the first place. Those people in those roles have a great responsibility, but public servants in general haven't signed up for those leadership roles, and their heads aren't on the chopping block. Ministers are, absolutely. Heads of departments are, absolutely.
Nick, respect for
Just
public servants.
just a general observation. Well, I think this goes, as Stephen reminds me and you about how long I've been around, one of the key differences between the state and federal parliaments is that there is a robust system of estimates, 3 times a year, up to 20 days of estimates, which I think is a very healthy thing. It means that departments go through a process of accountability. I think it's a really important safety valve to get the answers, to see how programs are running, to see whether there are any bumps in the road or matters that aren't going according to plan. We don't really have that. It's not a robust, it's not open, it's nowhere near as thorough in terms of what happens at a state level. It's not a criticism of Jay particularly, it's just something that has been the way it has been for many, many years under both administrations. A reform of the estimates process would be a very important safety valve to prevent some of these problems from getting bigger than they are, and I think that would be good for the public sector as well.
Hands up here, anyone who's ever prepared estimates papers for ministers. We do have an estimates process. What's not robust about it?
Firstly, it's once a year. It's only for several, I think 5 days a year. The federal process is 3 times a year. It involves almost 4 weeks of sitting. There are different rules and standing orders that apply in terms of questions that need to be answered. issues of orders for production of documents, issues in terms of when questions must be answered. It is much more comprehensive, and the fact that you have more time to drill down into what agencies are doing, into potential problems that are occurring, I think is important. And combined with whistleblower protection reforms, I think that would be a very important safety valve for the public sector to be as fearlessly as independent as it ought to be.
Thank you, Tammy. Quickly, and then we'll come to another question.
Just quickly, I've been a staffer for a senator and involved as a staffer for Senate estimates processes. They are pretty robust. We do have an estimates process in state parliament, and yes, it isn't quite as robust as those federal ones are. However, we also have Budget and Finance Committee, which goes all year round, and because South Australia has the only parliament in the Commonwealth, I believe, where the upper house isn't involved in the estimates process that only happens once a year, we have this very robust system of Budget and Finance Committee, which you all know. Those same people have probably had to prepare answers and responses for that process as well. What we do need to fix up is to ensure that when those public servants do provide answers to questions, whether they're in Parliament, questions on notice, questions without notice, or indeed through those processes, that they're actually tabled within a particular time frame. The provision of calling the documents, as is enjoyed in the Victorian Parliament, doesn't happen in SA. The documents exist, we just need to get them to the light of day and not actually have more sitting days or longer sitting hours or more processes that more public servants need to write more responses, given they already exist.
Thank you. There's some support there for that proposal. We have got 5 minutes more, room for one more question, and then we'll open to the floor. This is a question from a member. With the growing insecure nature of work, increased term contract staff working on higher duties above their classification, what action do the parties intend to take to provide public servants with more security in employment, enabling them to better access opportunities such as being able to get a car or a home loan? This is particularly an issue for younger people in the public service who might spend up to 10 years on contracts with no permanency.
Yeah, look, this is an issue which has been raised by a lot of people to me, and in fact they think this is an area where we potentially could save some money by taking people from being contractors to being permanent staff. It gives them greater certainty and security with their ability to go out and take out loans for a house and so on and so forth, but it could actually have the commensurate reduction some cost reduction for the public service in South Australia. So it's a classic example of a potential win-win.
Will you commit to having a review of that if you are in a position to?
Me, absolutely. I mean, it's been suggested by dozens of people that this is a very logical thing that is a win for everybody.
Yeah.
Maximise the amount of ongoing employment, minimising the amount of casual employment has to be the objective of any government. I mean, there is absolutely no reason why we should be having a policy where insecure employment is growing. What we've seen in the recent 12 months is quite a large increase in project work. Things like the energy plan have led to a massive number of contractual staff put on there. When we create our new Energy and Water Services Department, we'll be recruiting permanent staff to provide the ongoing roles there. There's going to be a very significant need for ongoing support for the important role of government in taking control of our energy system.
Tammy, any?
I've touched on it before. There is a high rate of casualisation. My federal colleague, Adam Bant, has actually introduced legislation into the federal parliament to ensure that we end that approach of casualisation, that people have the ability to move to permanent work if they really are actually permanent, but in everything but name. And we know that the flow-on effects are that added security, stability, ability to look to the future, to get a mortgage, and also it will encourage them to stay in this state.
Well, an hour into this discussion, I see a glimmer of hope. We actually see some bipartisan consensus between the Premier and Opposition Leader. I think we should work on that. I think we should actually set some clear targets to reduce the level of casualisation. I think that both major parties broadly agree with each other. I think that the PSA can play a key role in achieving some sensible targets. And I think, and further to what Tammy said, it almost needs to be almost a reverse onus, that you need to show very compelling reasons why you're not a permanent employee. And I think we can actually work on that. I'm actually encouraged by what's been said.
Let's start with SA pathology.
Thank you. Sorry, we're going to come to questions from the floor. Good point, thank you. We're now going to come to questions, as I just mentioned. I would ask, there's a lot to get through, obviously. I would ask that people don't make political statements. Keep it short, make it a question. If you want it asked of all four of them, make that clear, or them in particular, I'm sure they'll be happy to answer.
Look, I'm not aware of that situation, but I'm happy to look into it. Obviously, we need an enormous amount of assistance in the Child Protection Agency to meet this massive and growing task. You see, we've committed an extra $500 million to meet this growing need. We have, last time I looked at the numbers, we don't have the level of kinship care that exists in some other jurisdictions, so there is a capacity for us to improve our performance there. But it has to be, it can't be done at the expense of standards. I mean, the truth is child protection is always full of third, fourth, fifth best choices because all the first, second choices are gone, and so we're always having to weigh up perhaps placing them with a relative that we have some concerns at, but we're much happier than perhaps if they go to foster care or even into some commercial care. So this is a difficult challenge, especially when you're dealing with the interests of children and their identity in the context of their family. So, but I'd be horrified to think that we're lowering standards by using private sector providers, and I'm happy to look at that for you.
Look, I don't pretend this is an easy area, and I do accept what the Premier says. This is one of the hardest areas of public policy and program delivery. But the reality is our child protection system in South Australia has been a mess for a very long period of time. Margaret Nyland didn't say, look, this is a complex area of public policy, but they're doing a good job. She said it's actually in crisis. It's been in crisis for a very long period of time. Part of that is because the government hasn't had a focus on this area for a very long period of time. We had the failed Wetherill experiment of putting the Child Protection Unit in with the Education Department, the second largest department in South Australia, despite many people suggesting for a very long period of time this was counterproductive. Ultimately, Margaret Nyland recommended it be removed, and it finally was removed, but it was removed 5 years too late. We still have no dedicated minister taking responsibility for child protection in South Australia. We have two busy ministers, the Attorney General and the Deputy Premier, sharing child protection with Susan Close, the Minister for Education. We need a dedicated minister, we need a dedicated department, a dedicated chief executive to deal with this. That's the Liberal Party's policy. We're separating it out from the department. We're going to keep it out for a minimum 2-year period with a dedicated cabinet minister with no other responsibilities. The other critical thing around kinship is the over-representation of Aboriginal kids in the child protection system. One of the key recommendations from the Nyland Royal Commission was to have a dedicated Commissioner for Children and Young People for Aboriginal children. This has been rejected by the Labor Party. It's been accepted by the Liberal Party, and we'll put this in place if we form government on March 17. A dedicated Commissioner or a Deputy Commissioner for Children and Young People with responsibility for Aboriginal kids in care and Aboriginal kids more broadly has been in place in Victoria for years now, and they're getting excellent results because there are cultural issues which need to be taken into account with regards to kinship care for kids from an Aboriginal background. Yeah, I think it's a very reasonable question, but to be quite honest, until you raised it, I'd never heard that that was actually being done. I'm surprised the Premier didn't know about it. I mean, he is actually in government, but I think how many people in this room knew that that was actually occurring? I think this is what we need to find out more about.
Nick and Tammy?
Yeah, look, thank you, Heather, for your question. In direct answer to it, I think the fact, and it's not a criticism of the Premier or the opposition leader, I didn't know about it. I think now that it's been raised, I think it's incumbent on the government, on all of us here, and I'm sure the PSA will take this up, undertake an urgent assessment, an objective assessment as to whether this compromises the welfare of children. If it does, if it's a shortcut, then it needs to be reversed. And I'd like to think, and I say this with goodwill, that if it's brought to the government's attention and what you say is correct, and I have no reason to doubt it, then we need to remedy this as a matter of urgency.
Tammy?
Well, obviously outsourcing these things isn't going to get the best result, and if you are doing it to cost, that is not the criteria we should be using. I also want to echo, though, I hadn't heard of it before, but I had the good fortune to discuss these sorts of issues with the Commissioner for Aboriginal Children from Victoria, and that is a model where that voice would have been somebody you could have raised this with, and he could have taken a whole of government approach, or she. And some of the initiatives there have actually just been no cost, low cost, but getting kids back into kinship care in really innovative ways. Right? No, you know what? In really old-fashioned ways, actually, by involving the community and not outsourcing, these bits to different private bodies, but taking this as a community approach. And that's why I very strongly, and the Greens very strongly, support that role for a Commissioner for Aboriginal Children, because we think it will actually bring really good results as it is in Victoria.
Well, we're, just to speak for so we've announced a policy of legislating to make it an offence. So obviously there's underpayment of wages, which is a civil matter, but where somebody recklessly and persistently or deliberately underpays wages, we think that should be a criminal offence. I mean, sadly, this country, we've seen the essentially union membership has fallen, and this is traditionally a role that unions would play. We've seen relatively benign bureaucracies that don't do the job of actually getting out there and doing this. I think we need to put some more teeth back into the system. I think it is theft. When you know somebody deserves something, you pay a vulnerable person less than you know that they're entitled to be paid. It is theft. It's taking something from them, and you're depriving them of some value intentionally. And so we think it should be criminalised, and that's why we made that election commitment just a few weeks ago.
Mr. Marshall?
Look, it's difficult to comment because I'm not familiar with that particular story. I don't get a lot of people coming, raising issues as a Member of Parliament that they're underpayment of wages. Well, I'd be happy to take the issue up, but I can be honest, it's not underpayment of wages is not something that's been raised with me before in my seat.
Tammy?
A couple of things. It's one of the reasons why we've been strong advocates of the role of unions in the Parliament, where they are involved. We've seen unions stripped out of, again, the PSA processes. It's why we support the Young Workers Legal Service. It's why we support education of all workers about their rights. And it's why we stood up for the labour hire bill recently for some of the most vulnerable workers to be protected. But it's also why we call into account why the Wetherill government keeps giving Divine Ripe, now Perfection Fresh, government grants when they treat their workers abysmally. And I've been out with the NUW and I've seen some of the heard some of the stories from those workers. They're casualised, they're vulnerable, they're scared, and they're treated like crap. And yet, this government keeps giving them money. Now, the industry advocate could perhaps play a role here, but we shouldn't be awarding any of those companies any government money if they're performing like this.
So just shortly, I agree with the Premier's approach, but also it's a question of access to justice, so that if you have an entitlement, if you have a claim, often people just give up because they haven't got the legal representation, and that's why I think community legal centres are so important in our society.
Yeah, we've accepted it in principle. It is true. It's being something we're working to transition through. It's ferociously expensive, as you can imagine. We're trying to reduce the number of kids in residential care, which is obviously the way in which this can be manageable. So hopefully by reducing the population and then gradually increasing the capacity to have people working on every shift at all times, we'll be able to get to that objective. But that's certainly our objective.
And similarly with the Liberal Party, we accepted that recommendation in the Nyland report, and we do accept the government's explanation that this is something which is in transition and is not difficult to affect, not easy to affect very quickly. Obviously, one of the points that we continually highlight is the number of kids in residential care and emergency care in South Australia, which costs the taxpayer hugely, and the money really needs to be going in earlier in the cycle, preventing the kids ever getting into that situation. Now, there's been legislation in the South Australian Parliament for a long period of time, well before Nyland, which has just been completely and utterly ignored by this administration. We need to move to a preventative approach rather than this ambulance at the bottom of the cliff.
Have to concur with the preventative approach. It really does need to be prioritised. Of course, we've now got a situation where we've seen crises and we've seen, in some cases, knee-jerk reaction, because I want to specifically say with the psychometric testing, I understand that there's grave concerns about some of the implications of that, and it's definitely not a silver bullet, and we share those concerns and note that, you know, the PSA and others have been advocating on that.
And that preventative approach is fundamental. I moved amendments in the State Parliament back in 2005, which were the subject of comments by the coroner in the Chloe Valentine inquest that required that there be proper assessments of parents who had children in their care who had a significant substance abuse problem. The coroner made findings, and I think that's what Stephen may have been alluding to in part, and something that I worked constructively with Vicky Chapman with, said that that was ignored. I think we need to look at the issue of substance abuse so that children aren't at risk in the first place. And I was in the Riverland a couple of days ago. The incidence of ice use and the parents I spoke to about the devastations it's caused and the impact it has on those individuals who happen to have children in their care is something that we need to address very urgently, and maybe then we'll have fewer children in residential care.
From my definition of public education, public health, the essential utilities of water and energy, they are obviously police, an essential service. They're the essential services that I think we talk about when we mean essential services.
It's a broad question. I think most of the services that are provided by the public service are essential services. I think the point that we're sort of railing against is the blowout in the size of ministerial offices, the blowout in the size of consultants, the blowout in the size of the advertising budget, the blowout in the size of projects which have been outsourced to the private sector because therefore there won't be any movement in budget versus actual, but they're the projects where there's the largest variation in budget to actual. So they're the areas that we are railing against in the Liberal Party.
I did say it in when I first spoke. Transport, education, electricity, water, health, and I said a few more as well.
And I agree with everything the other three have said. It's all pretty sensible.
He should be going first on these answers, not he just says ditto every time.
Yeah, sure, and I'm happy to address that. In terms of the corporate tax cuts, the government was pushing for cuts for corporations earning more than $1 billion a year. We pegged it at $50 million because your IGA supermarket in the suburbs, this is turnover, not profit, an IGA supermarket can have a turnover of $20 or $30 or $40 million a year. If that means that supermarket can compete more effectively with a slightly lower tax rate as against Coles and Woolies, I think it's justifiable. But we said that was it. We don't want to go any further than that. So there's a misconception. It's not about profits. It's actually about turnover. So for some low turnover business, that's not unreasonable. In relation to Gonski, the position is this. When we were faced with the government indicated, the Turnbull government said they were going to increase funding, a new funding model. We negotiated for an increased $4.9 billion in funding, $424 million. I know the Premier says that wasn't so much the full Gonski, but the dilemma I was faced with is that when David Gonski and his panel said it would have been a disaster for public education, for students, if that package didn't pass, then we felt that we needed to get that package through. In relation to pensions, we resisted changes of the Abbott government and then the Turnbull government in terms of the way that pensions would be indexed, and we resisted that and we minimised the impact of that. So we've tried to steer a middle course. It may not be to everyone's satisfaction, but we have tried to actually reach, I think, a compromise from the political centre.
Would anyone like
Sorry, and the ABCC. Well, look, the great paradox here is that one of the union leaders that saying this about him may be the kiss of death. I actually quite like dealing with Michael O'Connor, even though they've spent a fortune campaigning against me. I think on the timber industry, I agree with him. I think that the CFMEU has been pretty right in terms of growing the timber sector. It was a situation where we moved a number of amendments to the ABCC legislation that actually ameliorated the effects of that legislation, but still had an independent watchdog for an industry where even the previous Labor administration, when Bill Shorten was Workplace Minister, said that they needed to have a special form of watchdog. We gave rights of administrative review, rights of judicial review in terms of decisions of the ABCC, and required the ABCC not to behave in the partisan political way it did, and I think it's a good thing that Nigel Haskins has gone. So happy to give you more details, but we tried to steer a middle course, and in return for that, we've actually got some whistleblower protections which I thought are very meaningful.
Anyone want to comment on?
Yeah, I mean, Nick just brushes off that he broke a promise to the South Australian people to stand up for Gonski funding. Just brushes it off as though it didn't happen. The problem with that is that all of the commitments that he's given you today, what happens when the pressure comes on post the election and somebody says, oh, look, you know, we've got GST cuts, or we've got to pay for these tax cuts. The only way we can get it through the Parliament is for you, Nick, to make a compromise again. We don't want you to make a compromise. We sent you to Canberra to do a job, which was to stand up against the education cuts. And there's a lot of people that walked into those schools and actually cast a vote for you at that last election on the basis that you said you would stand up against the $210 million cuts to Gonski. And then you got there, and then you turned around and you voted for it. And then worse than that, the arguments you used to justify it are the same arguments the Liberals used to make the cuts in the first place. The same thing that Tony Abbott said was that somehow the money was never there and we can't afford it. Yet we can afford somehow corporate tax cuts for businesses. I wouldn't mind so much if people were consistent. They say, oh, look, there's no money in the coffer, we can't afford all of this stuff. But the same budget they said they wanted to impose the Gonski education cuts, they also thought there was $50 billion available for corporate tax cuts. How does that work? But what it comes down to is priorities. It's a question of whether you put public education, not just public education, I might say, the cuts are across the whole sector, they fall most heavily on public education. It's a question of whether you prioritise education or whether you prioritise putting some extra dough back in the pockets of corporations. It's as simple as that.
Mr. Marshall, your comment?
Well, I mean, really about Nick's positions.
Giving you all the opportunity, Tammy? No?
Oh, something that I would have loved to have seen is our senators in the Senate there stand up for the schools the way they stood up for the stubs. And you were judged on how you, when faced with challenges, whether you stand up and fight. And I think we should have stood up and fought for that deal and made it happen. And the only way you do make these things happen, and unions know this, you know, you fight back. You fight and you stand up and you argue the case. We should have done that with our schools funding.
Yeah, can I just start off on that? Look, NDIS, I'm very proud to say that South Australia was the first state to be one of the trial sites, and this is a great Labor achievement nationally. It is true to say that it received bipartisan support, and I think it's a great achievement for our nation. It's up there with Medicare as one of the great reforms. It's not going to be without its challenges. Obviously, it's a federal bureaucracy that's running, and they are running into some choppy water. But the good thing to remember is there is a massive amount of extra money going into disability services funding. And so the reform is always hard, but when you've got lots of dough, it's a whole lot easier. So we've gone from a system that's had $200 or $300 million in it not so many years ago to $1.4 billion being invested in the disability sector. The challenge for us is actually going to be finding the workers. So every single worker in the public service should have no doubt that they're going to have a job if they continue to want one in this sector. It is critical, though, that if there are any changes that are being asked of people, that they be supported in that. We need to honour the fact that if people have rights in the public service, that they continue to be supported in that, and to make good choices about whether they decide to work with some other organisation. They shouldn't be going for a lower wage, because it's essentially the same business, going out into some of these non-government organisations. So I've been pretty pleased with how the transition's been handled. It's been sensitively handled. It's been difficult, and it hasn't been without its bumps. But I think we'll continue to respectfully manage that transition to this new system.
Look, to be quite honest, on this one, we are definitely on a unity ticket. The reality is that this is a major transformation. There are going to be some bumps along the way. I think the question was really about what about the staff that are currently within the state jurisdiction who are going to have to transition. I do support what the Premier says. There are going to be far more jobs. In fact, I'm more concerned that there are not going to be enough people, and this is why yesterday the Liberal Party came out and said that we'll put another $100 million on the table to be matched by the federal government, so $200 million for apprenticeships and traineeships in South Australia to make sure that we have those skills in place to meet the needs, whether it be in defence or manufacturing or health or NDIS, because I think that there is a skill shortage coming in South Australia because of the very low rate of commencement for apprenticeships and traineeships, and this is one critical area. The NDIS is requiring, and they've done the workforce planning, enormous increases into the future, and I'm really concerned that we are not prepared, and that will ultimately mean that people who have sort of been waiting for a long period of time, being promised finally the services that they deserve, are going to be disappointed because we haven't done that workforce planning as effectively as possible.
Nick, Tammy?
It's a magnificent scheme that must be properly implemented. I think it is a genuinely great legacy for Julia Gillard. The question is implementation. We've already heard from the Mental Health Coalition that there'll be people slipping through the cracks that won't get the same level of support. There are concerns in the autism space that people won't be getting as much as they did under previous schemes, and here I'm talking about in other states from what I've been told. So it's a question of implementation, providing the support. I think everyone's on a unity ticket. We just want it to work, but we need to be ever vigilant in its implementation.
I'm sorry we've run out of time for questions. I know there's still hands up, but please thank the Premier, Opposition Leader, Tammy Franks MLC, Nick Xenophon, SABC. It's all yours now.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Could I just in closing say thank you to everybody who stood up to ask questions tonight. Apologies to those of you who wanted to ask questions and we ran out of time. This could go on for another 24 hours if we so choose, I'm sure. Thank you in particular to Victoria for facilitating the panel discussion and the questions. What a great job. I'd like to thank our Premier, Jay Weatherill, Stephen Marshall, Tammy Franks and Nick Xenophon for taking the time to come and speak to everyone tonight and for being open to take questions from the floor, regardless of which side of politics you come from. I admire anybody who goes into the politics. It's not an easy job to sit on this stage, answer those questions and to stand for their electorate. So well done to all of them. I think it goes a long way to show the importance and high regard in which the Public Service Association and our membership is held, that the leaders from these parties have attended our forum. This union is a formidable force with strong members in all of our worksites, and whether you are a worksite representative or not, every one of you has an important role to play and a loud voice to be heard. I would like to thank everyone, especially our PSA members, for attending tonight. I know we are all invested in the subjects presented, not only as public sector workers, whose work is important to us, but as members of the South Australian community who benefit and rely on the public services and the state rightly provides. As evidenced by the questions we've just heard, PSA members are united in our pride of being public sector workers and the services that we deliver. And equally, we want to be able to continue to deliver those services to the best of our ability and for the best outcomes for the South Australian community, with a surety from our government, whoever that may be, that we will be properly supported to do so. Thank you to all the PSA staff who've made this forum possible. It's been quite a large logistics exercise. Well done. A lot of hard work goes into doing this, and it's really, truly appreciated by all of us here tonight. Thank you. With that, once again, I thank our guests for offering our members the opportunity to hear at first hand your respective positions. It was far more interesting than staying at home watching Married at First Sight, I'm sure. And I look forward to continuing the work of the PSA in promoting the importance of the public sector and the vital role that all PSA members play, standing together, fighting together. And let's remember, SA is not for sale. Take a fly with you. Talk about it to your members in the workplace. And for those of you who are worksite reps, there's a conference on the 4th of May. Please be there. Thank you all very much for attending.